Treasuries and the subsequent move higher, a dramatic move higher in yields across the curve. But today, we had a reversal, and the catalyst may have been this very strong auction of 2-year Treasury bonds. Maybe these prices were so low they were simply irresistible. Now, that seemed to trigger buying across the curve. On the shorter end, we had the yield on the 2-year dropping about 7 basis points to 2.09%. On the longer end, the 10-year today fell about 8 basis points to 2.29%. But in spite of the drop in rates, we had weakness in the equity market. Explain that. With the S&P 500 today down about 1.2%, the Dow weaker by 1.3%, similar decline for the NASDAQ composite. Troublesome may have been this rally that we had in crude oil with WTI jumping more than 5%. That's after the U.S. and the EU seemed to close in on a deal to reduce demand for Russian energy. However, right now we're seeing a little bit of weakness in crude, 114.30 here in the electronic session. We're looking at a little bit of strength in the dollar, the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index picking up about 0.1%. A weaker yen, though, at 121.09. Chicago Nikkei futures, though, imply a move lower of maybe 500 points in the Nikkei. Maybe the Japanese equity market is a little troubled by this persistent move up in the price of energy. And we'll get the PMI data for Japan. That's probably the highlight of the eco data for the region. We'll talk more about market action for you in about 15 minutes. Ed Baxter has global headlines from the Bloomberg Newsroom in San Francisco. Ed.
All right, thank you, Douglas. As the NATO nations prepare to meet tomorrow, it has moved more troops to the borders of Ukraine. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is warning Russia against making threats that could escalate the war. NATO reporting out that 7,000 to 15,000 Russian troops have been killed during the invasion. This as U.S. President Joe Biden arrives in Brussels with a new packet of sanctions. Tomorrow, NATO and the Group of Seven and EU meet. Searchers have found the voice recorder now of the China Eastern plane that crashed. Hong Kong may yet mass test residents. Chief Executive Carrie Lam says as cases fall, the city would like to identify the remaining cases. South Korean government has asked crematories to increase their capacity and funeral homes to secure more refrigerators. And on the 2-year anniversary of the lockdown in the UK, Omicron BA2 variant cases have risen anew. U.S. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky says deaths from Omicron continue to fall, but an increase in cases in New York and New York City. Dr. Anthony Fauci says a second booster is on the way with the filing of Pfizer and Moderna papers. Moderna's filed for vaccination for kids under 6. And the political rhetoric continued today for the third day in the nomination process of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. Senator Lindsey Graham went on a tirade again. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter. This is Bloomberg. All right, Brian.
All right, Ed, 10 minutes before the top of the hour, it's time now for the Daybreak Asia Media and News Review. From the South China Morning Post, Hong Kong will seek to promote itself as a vibrant city. It's going to invite 200 top foreign investors to attend a summit to watch the Rugby Sevens games and visit China in November. The paper cites the Financial Secretary, Paul Chan. Chan says the Rugby Sevens tournament will be a good opportunity to invite what he referred to as our friends from the top financial institutions from around the world and the mainland. Chan also said that the border with the mainland could be reopened by then. From the New York Times, this is a Tom Friedman piece. The last 5 years saw the world's 3 most powerful leaders, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Donald Trump, each take drastic steps to hold on to power beyond their designated terms of office. One failed, 2 succeeded. And therein lies a tale that says so much about our world today. Trump failed for one very simple reason: American institutions, as well as laws and norms. They all forced him to cede power at the end of his 4 years. And that was despite his efforts to discredit the electoral results and his unleashing of supporters to intimidate lawmakers. Putin and Xi, he says, fared better so far. Unencumbered by institutions and democratic norms, they installed new laws to make themselves effectively presidents for life. And just a quick word on one of those 2 black boxes found on the China Eastern Airlines plane that crashed this week. The black box recovered is the cockpit voice recorder, and I just mentioned this because RTHK quoted an official, one of the regulators, as saying that the recorder has been severely damaged, but the storage units, while also damaged to some extent, are relatively complete. So that could be quite interesting to get those details. 8 minutes now before the top of the hour. That's the media. Rashad, to you.
All right, indeed. Let's get over now to our next guest. It's Ye Xie, Bloomberg Bond and Foreign Exchange reporter, discussing what's been going on with the markets and, well, where does one begin really at the moment with that? But I want to just get to this this headline that we had that we could talk about, and it is this curious. It's a curious headline. It's markets think that the Federal Reserve is actually dovish. Can you explain why?
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, so if we look at the nominal yield has increased quite a lot in the last couple of days as the Fed turned very hawkish to contain inflation. But most of these increase in yields was driven by inflation expectations embedded in break-even rates. So real yields is actually coming down. And look at the inflation expectations embedded in the next 2 years. It's about like 50 to 100 basis points higher than Fed's forecasts. And in the meantime, if we look at the dots, the market pricing a lot of hikes this year, but next year they're coming below the median forecast of the 2023 dots, which is at 2.75%. So if we taken this together, market thinking that inflation is going to be a lot higher than Fed expected, and the Fed is not going to raise rates as much as they promised, or at least implied on the dot plots. So that's probably explained why the equity market has done reasonably well in the last couple of days until today. Yeah, so the market doesn't really buy the argument that the Fed is fully committed to really break down the inflation.
What did you make of the rally in the bond market today?
As we explained, the yield has increased quite a lot, especially on the short end side. And look at the 10-year, if we draw the trend line, since over the past 40 years, was right at the top of these trend line resistance. So a lot of these are technical, oversold kind of conditions. But in terms of market's pricing, historically, the yields, say 10 years, they don't really peak until towards the end of the tightening cycle. And we are just at the beginning. In other words, we could see yields moving higher after periods of consolidation.
Well, this is it as well. And, you know, we've seen, curiously enough, the equity market acting for some investors almost as a hedge against inflation. It seems a bit bizarre and a bit kind of dangerous to do that, isn't it?
Yeah. So historically, rising inflation, if it's a moderate and sort of like a steady increase inflation, not too high, and this indicated a period of growth, and the company can passing all these rising costs to the consumers. And they typically have boosted earnings. That typically is a good environment to buy stocks. But at the moment, inflation is really high, and the Fed is tightening. Fed is deliberately trying to cool the growth down and tightening the financial conditions. So yeah, that kind of argument just seems to be a little different now.
Let's talk a little bit about China. We had the big buyback, stock buyback by Alibaba. Xiaomi joined in. It's not as prevalent in the Chinese companies as it is with American companies, but there it is. Tencent chose not to do it, saying it would use the money for developing its business. Alibaba has a lot more cash on the balance sheet than Tencent, as I understand it. Do you expect more companies to actually follow Alibaba rather than Tencent?
Yeah, I think so. There are a couple of reasons to do that. One is that their stock is coming down a lot, so it's relatively cheap for them to buy the back. And the second reason is that in the past, as you mentioned, that the Chinese companies historically don't do a lot of buybacks because they then they could make more money by reinvesting all these profits instead of doing all these financial engineering. And as the Tencent earnings report showed, this sort of like a very fast expansion period seems to be coming to an end, that return to a more normal growth. So there's another reason that they give them, they're probably going to use the buyback as a better use of their cash. And lastly, I talked to a guy, Jason, who is chairman of Radiant Global Advisors. He said that the buying back, especially for the ADR market, Alibaba, say JD.com, all these companies, so they gradually buying more back, basically taking all these shares off the hands of foreign investors, is a way for them to gradually retreat from the ADR market to reduce the listing risks.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Of course, it's a kind of way of giving money back to your investors, too. Yeah, Bloomberg Bond and FX reporter with us, and we'll have the top stories next. This is Bloomberg. Now, Bloomberg traffic and weather. The Cross Bronx Expressway still an extra 35 minutes into the George Washington Bridge. Traffic backed up to about the Sheridan. The ride in Manhattan, the west side is better than it was, but it's still slow in spots, mid-90s to the mid-130s. The Harlem River Drive, an extra 10-15 minutes getting up to the George Washington Bridge. Still a broken down car, the eastbound Big QE at Queens Boulevard, and delays there coming off the Kosciuszko Bridge. Southern State Parkway, an extra 15 minutes still this evening eastbound for the Meadowbrook out towards Route 110 in New Jersey. 18 on the northbound on the ramp to Easton Avenue in New Brunswick. That is still closed for sinkhole repair. Sports, Nets visit Memphis. Knicks are in Charlotte. Devils skate in Toronto. Exhibition baseball tonight. Yankees are playing Baltimore. Bloomberg 11:30, 3-day weather. Tonight, periods of rain. Lows 40 to 45. Thursday, a rainy day. High 50 to 55. Friday, partly sunny. Still could be a shower. High of 60. And Saturday, sunny clouds. Highs near 55. Right now in Central Park, 42 degrees. Skies are cloudy. This report brought to you by Anshin Accountants and Advisors, proactively identifying tax savings opportunities so that you're not leaving money on the table. Visit Anshin.com. With the best ride in and out of the city, I'm Ed Kalegi, Bloomberg 1130, bringing you global news 24 hours a day.
From the financial capital of the world, this is WDBR New York, Bloomberg 1130.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia for this Thursday, March 24th in Hong Kong, Wednesday, March 23rd in New York. Coming up this hour,
U.S. stocks fall ahead of tighter monetary policy from the Fed.
the U.S. and Europe close in on a deal to cut demand for Russian energy.
Tencent's revenue grows at the slowest pace since its 2004 listing.
NATO deploys more troops and warns Russia against chemical and nuclear rhetoric. Searchers find the China Eastern voice recorder. Hong Kong may mass test yet, and UK sees a surge. I'm Ed Baxter with Global News.
Could Formula One be looking to increase from 24 to 30 races per year? I'm Dan Schwartzman. I'll have that story and more coming up in Bloomberg Sports.
That's all straight ahead on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. On Bloomberg 1130 New York, Bloomberg 99.1 Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 106.1 Boston, Bloomberg 960 San Francisco, Sirius XM 119, and around the world on BloombergRadio.com and via the Bloomberg Business app.
Now, 8 in the morning in Tokyo, we're an hour away from trading in Japanese equities. Index futures imply a little bit of weakness here for Japan. We'll talk more about that in a moment. If you're joining from anywhere in the APAC, good morning. I'm Doug Krisner at the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in San Francisco.
And I'm Paul Allen in Sydney. It's 1 minute past 10 on Thursday morning. And Bloomberg Daybreak Asia is presented by Interactive Brokers. Interactive Brokers charges margin loan rates from 0.75% to 1.58%. Rates are subject to change. You can learn more at ibkr.com/compare. Well, we've just opened for trade here in Sydney for a look at how we're shaping up for another trading day in Asia. Let's get to Brian Curtis. Brian?
Not too much happening in the first few moments. As you know, it's a slow start there. The ASX 200 is essentially flat here. We mentioned that Nikkei futures suggest a fairly sizable drop in the cash market when the Nikkei starts to trade. The Nikkei is up 6% in the past month. It got 3% of that yesterday. So it may be natural to give some back today, and it was kind of a day of selling in both Europe and the United States. Looks like we might see about 500 points of downside at the open. The yen's still pretty weak here. Dollar yen 121.08. We had the dollar up, and we had gold up, and we had crude oil up. Gold, in fact, up to $1,950 now. So pretty